This video will go over the card Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, why I believe the card is too good and warping Modern into an unhealthy state, why it's unfun and leads to bad play patterns, and arguments its proponents have for it with counter-arguments against them. But of course, this isn't exactly a hot take. Many players dislike Ragavan and want it banned. In general, there's always a boogeyman of the format, with players complaining and calling for bans, and there are plenty of other problematic cards in the format that you could argue over. But I think Ragavan is in a unique position, and while it certainly doesn't feel as bad as, say, getting griefed twice on turn 1, I think it represents a bigger problem in the format. I'll first lay out the arguments for why Ragavan is too good, is damaging the Modern format, and should be banned. Then, I'll go over what I think are the strongest arguments its proponents give and my rebuttals to them. First, let's go over the arguments for banning Ragavan. The card is simply too pushed. It feels like Wizards had a number of dials they could turn on its various stats and abilities, and they cranked them all up to 11.
If you can see, the numbers all go to 11. Look, right across the board. 11, 11,
and most of
11.
It's a 1 mana 2/1 that makes mana, draws cards, has haste, and dodges sorcery speed removal and sweepers. It has almost no drawbacks, no checks and balances, and is good at every point in the game. To see how ridiculous Ragavan is, let's compare it to Deathrite Shaman. Deathrite Shaman has been on Modern's ban list for a while for being too good. It was argued in the past that Deathrite was the best creature ever printed, and many players joked that it was a 1 mana planeswalker. So what makes Deathrite Shaman so powerful? Well, it gives you a turn 1 mana accelerant that does other things besides just adding mana. This means being able to win the game on its own, including in the mid to late game when mana acceleration isn't as good anymore, something mana darks are not supposed to do for balance reasons. It breaks the color pie by letting non-green decks have access to ramp. Deathrite Shaman can also gain life and is main deckable graveyard hate, which admittedly are things that Ragavan doesn't do. However, Deathrite Shaman has actual costs to use its abilities. You have to have lands, creatures, or spells in the graveyard to exile to it, and the life abilities cost mana to activate. Additionally, you have to choose whether to add mana or gain or drain life. You can't do both. Ragavan has no costs. You get to attack your opponent, damaging them and ramping you and hitting a card. Ragavan has haste due to being able to dash it, and because it makes a treasure when it connects, the dash cost is effectively only 1 mana. Dash protects Ragavan from sorcery speed removal and sweepers. If your only answer to it is Prismatic Ending, Wrenn and 6 pinging it, or Supreme Verdict, you're out of luck. Dash also means you don't even have to wait a turn when you top deck it later in the game. You can just dash it immediately. The treasures can be banked over multiple turns if you don't spend them, letting a single card essentially ramp you by more than 1 mana. And what I find to be the most egregious ability, it exiles random cards from the top of the opponent's deck and lets you cast them. The cards are not restricted by color since the treasures let you cast anything regardless of color requirements, and it has a huge element of randomness to games. Games are now won or lost by playing Ragavan on turn 1 or getting lucky and flipping something good off its trigger. Now sure, sometimes Ragavan hits a land or something else you can't cast and the exile trigger winds up being of no value that turn, but other times it makes all the difference. I've played and witnessed games where Ragavan exiles both Valakuts out of Amulet Titan back to back. There are games where it exiles a singleton Shockland a player was planning on fetching out of their multicolor deck, forcing them to fetch something else and thus screwing up their mana. Games where Ragavan on the play exiles Teferi Time Raveler out of Blue-White Control and shuts down all their counter spells on turn 2. These are just some particularly notable examples. More often than not, it's more a matter of just getting ahead on card advantage, whether that be exiling an additional threat in the form of a planeswalker or creature, or getting something that draws cards. Players don't want to play games, and especially lose games, due to random chance. There was already an element of this with other cards like Dredgers or Collected Company, but I'd argue Ragavan is the most egregious perpetrator from the standpoint of how obvious it is and how often it happens. The thing is, these elements might have been alleviated if even just a single one of them were toned down. Ragavan could have not had dash, or the dash cost could have been higher, like 3 or 4 mana, or maybe if you dash it then you don't get the trigger. Or it could have only made 1 treasure at a time, or it could have been a different treasure-like token that only made red mana, or it could have just added a red mana that you had to spend by the end of the turn. Or it could have not exiled cards, or you could only cast the card with a restriction, like it had to be a red card, or it couldn't cost more than 1 or 2 mana. The point is, there were plenty of ways for Ragavan to mostly retain the essence of what it is now, but not be too pushed. As is, it's egregious and damaging the format. It's so good that it's already been banned in Legacy. Ragavan gives Delver-style tempo decks something they shouldn't have, a 1-drop that's good at all points in the game, ramps them, and draws cards. As a result, the format has become hyper-efficient and is pushing out any strategy that can't consistently deal with it. Murktide, Rakdos Scam, and non-combo based Underworld Breach decks together make up around 25% of the format. While these decks have their differences, they're all kinda doing the same thing, with all of them being half-red Ragavan tempo decks. Then around 10% of the format is made up of hammer decks which, while they don't play Ragavan, fall into the same you must interact by turn 1 or lose play patterns. When lists are main decking 4 copies of Spell Pierce, something has gone wrong. Now, these aren't the only decks you can play. Other decks like Creativity, Cascade, Yawgmoth, and so on do exist and do get good results. Ragavan doesn't invalidate them all. But this does mean that roughly 1 out of every 3 games you play are defined by these hyper-efficient tempo decks, and many games come down to the play, draw, die roll and whether you have interaction on turn 1. Some players find these games enjoyable. Personally, I don't, and I think a lot of other players don't either. So let's move on to the counter-arguments. The best arguments I've seen for Ragavan are: 1. It encourages interaction. If Ragavan is good enough that players need removal for it, it means they have to play removal and can't solely focus on solitaire-esque combo or synergy decks that largely ignore the other player, the old 2 ships passing in the night problem Modern has been accused of before. 2. Ragavan is bad against blockers and dies to most removal spells. It's not universally good and gets sideboarded out against decks like Yawgmoth, where the abundance of cheap recursive blockers make it ineffective. 3. Ragavan has deck building restrictions. You have to play removal and counter spells to clear the way of blockers so Ragavan can attack. There's also disingenuous bad faith arguments such as get good, dismissing people as casuals or because you don't have enough money to afford Ragavan, that's why you hate it. These sort of glib, dismissive statements aren't arguments, they're character attacks, the domain of trolls and not good faith actors. So, putting those aside, let's address the actual arguments for it. 1. Ragavan encourages interaction. Any threat encourages interaction. Hogak encourages interaction. Or if that's too dissimilar for you, let's take a hypothetical card as an example. This is an imaginary card called Answer Me or Die. It's a 1-mana legendary green creature with 1 toughness and 20 power and has no abilities. Is this card fair, fun to play against, or does it lead to a better format because it encourages interaction? Obviously not. This is clearly an unfair comparison because Ragavan isn't as good as this hypothetical card. After all, Ragavan doesn't win the game in 1 hit. Except sometimes it does. Sometimes the treasure lets you play Blood Moon on turn 2 and the game effectively ends on the spot, or you otherwise flip a card that puts you way ahead on resources. This leads me to 2. Ragavan dies to removal. The argument that Ragavan dies to removal isn't a good one either, as this is the old dies to Doomblade argument. A creature can be dealt with by removal spells and still be too good. It's a philosophy that naively assumes that all players always have access to removal spells at all times and doesn't stand up to even a few seconds of scrutiny. If your opponent has a Ragavan, just bolt it, just push it, just cast Solitude. Sometimes you don't have removal. Sometimes your removal costs more than 1 mana. Sometimes you just didn't draw any, or you had to mulligan and prioritize other cards to keep. Ragavan doesn't encourage removal, it demands removal on turn 1 every game. When you go into a match, you know your opponent could play it on turn 1. You have to build your deck with and keep hands with 1 mana removal spells. If you don't draw any, but your opening hand is otherwise good, do you mulligan for removal or keep it and cross your fingers? 3. Ragavan requires you to play your own removal, or stated another way, Ragavan can be blocked and thus creates a deck building restriction since you need to play your own removal. Yes, creatures can be blocked, and if you want to attack your opponent, you'll need your own removal spells to clear the way. This isn't a deck building restriction. A deck building restriction implies that you have to build your deck in a way that you wouldn't want to normally to satisfy some condition of 1 or more cards in your deck. Cascade spells have a deck building restriction because you can't play anything with a mana value less than 3. Collected Company has a deck building restriction because you need to fill your deck with around 25 2 to 3 mana creatures. Playing removal spells is something you already want to be doing in the tempo decks Ragavan is played in, the same way that Ancient Stirrings doesn't have a deck building restriction in Tron where it can hit every card. It's especially laughable since Ragavan itself means that every deck needs to play cheap removal to answer it. Essentially, its own existence necessitates its supposed restriction. My conclusion is that Ragavan needs to go. Do I own a playset of Ragavans myself? Yes, I do. Did I spend almost $300 on them? Yes, I did. I play the game to have fun, not as a financial investment, and Ragavan makes the game less fun. So, since my arguments were so well thought out and brilliant, I'm sure no one will have a problem with them and definitely won't make any bad faith, disingenuous, or trollish arguments in the comments. If you're someone who wants to make some good faith arguments in the comments, please go ahead and share your thoughts. Thank you to my supporters, and if you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel, and take care.